Let's talk about the economic war. While everyone's been focused on the Middle East, something big is brewing in Europe. And it's not good. Remember all the discussions about de-dollarization? Well, things are about to accelerate. The EU is taking a bold step that could shake the foundations of the Western financial system even further. Since they've decided to seize frozen Russian assets and give the profits to Ukraine, this is opening a Pandora's box. And this time, it's going to be far worse. In our lead story today, the EU is finalizing a plan to tap into frozen Russian reserves. It's a stunning move that crosses a major economic red line. Ursula von der Leyen is pushing a proposal to use profits generated from around $220 billion in Russian assets to fund Ukraine's rebuilding. They've already gained backing from Janet Yellen in the US and the UK government, so this is quickly becoming a coordinated effort. The plan is to extract an estimated €3 billion per year from these frozen assets to support Ukraine. But this is just the beginning. Why is this happening now? Because the West is under pressure. It's funding two simultaneous conflicts, one in Ukraine and now another in the Middle East. Billions are being poured into war efforts, and there's no end in sight. The thinking now is, if they can't keep spending from their own budgets, they'll just use Russia's money. And the EU has more ambitious ideas. They could take that $220 billion and invest it in something like German 2-year bonds yielding 3%. That would bring in about $6.6 billion annually, more than double the current windfall plan. This isn't just about economics, it's about keeping Ukraine in the fight, especially now that US support is slipping. With the new House Speaker, Mike Johnson, aid to Ukraine is no longer a priority. He's speeding up support for Israel instead. That leaves Europe scrambling to cover Ukraine's war costs. And what's the easiest option on the table? Frozen Russian assets. It's money just sitting there. From the EU's perspective, why not use it? But Russia sees this very differently. Freezing their reserves was one thing. Actually using them to fund Ukraine is something else entirely. Putin is playing a long game. His strategy is to drain the West economically, to make the United States and European Union borrow endlessly, drive up bond yields, and push their economies toward financial crisis. At the same time, he's limiting energy supply to fuel inflation and keep interest rates high. Germany is already in recession. The rest of Europe is close behind. And with the United States shifting focus to Israel, Putin's strategy is starting to work. But if the European Union uses those Russian funds, they'll keep the Ukraine war going, at Russia's expense. Investing that money into Eurozone bonds not only funds the war, it also helps lower borrowing costs in Europe by supporting bond prices. Now Russia is fighting back. According to Reuters, Moscow is threatening retaliation if the European Union proceeds. One of Putin's close allies has warned of a tit-for-tat strategy, saying Russia would seize even more Western assets in response. And this is no idle threat. Russia has already done this. Back in April, they took control of utility companies owned by Germany and Finland. Then in July, they nationalized the assets of French company Danone and Denmark's Carlsberg. This would just be the next step. Seizing Russian reserves may also trigger panic among other central banks. Countries like China, India, or other BRICS nations could start pulling out of euro and dollar assets and shift into gold or domestic reserves. Why risk keeping money in the West if it can be confiscated? They'll bring those assets home and avoid the Federal Reserve, Bank of England, or European Central Bank altogether. And while Russia's obviously furious, Saudi Arabia is also upset. This time about developments in the Middle East. The Saudi government has publicly criticized Israel's ground offensive, warning that it could destabilize the entire region. This is a major concern for the kingdom. Why? Because of the Saudi-Israeli normalization talks. Saudi Arabia has been inching toward a deal with Israel, which could include a nuclear energy agreement with the United States, but now that deal is under threat. Saudi Arabia is furious with the way things are unfolding, and it's putting their long-term goals in jeopardy. Saudi Arabia has long wanted to move away from oil dependency and diversify its economy. That's part of its Vision 2030 plan. A normalization deal with Israel was a big piece of that puzzle, and President Biden has hinted that the deal is still possible once the conflict settles. But now things are getting complicated. Saudi Arabia is part of the broader Arab world, and there's growing frustration with Israel's military operations. If Israel continues escalating in Gaza, it will put Riyadh in a very difficult spot. Crown Prince MBS might have to say goodbye to his Vision 2030 timeline, and re-entering the normalization talks will become much harder. The longer the war goes on, the tougher it becomes for Saudi Arabia to publicly reconcile with Israel. And maybe Biden is right. Maybe this conflict was designed, in part, to derail the Saudi-Israeli deal. Either way, the pressure is now on Israel to back off, and Saudi Arabia is urging them to stop the assault. The kingdom doesn't want to lose its shot at a nuclear energy deal with the United States, but that may already be slipping away. And just a few hours ago, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu made it clear there won't be a ceasefire. That means relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia are likely to deteriorate even further. And beyond diplomacy, there's a more immediate issue: oil. The energy sector still makes up over 40% of Saudi Arabia's GDP. It's massive. And if the regional situation worsens, Iran or its proxies might step in. That could threaten Saudi Arabia's oil exports. Geographically, the kingdom doesn't border Israel, so direct conflict is unlikely. But their oil infrastructure is concentrated around the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow passage under Iranian control. If that gets shut down, the bulk of Saudi oil shipments would be halted, and that would be catastrophic. Zoom in on their infrastructure, and it's clear. Most of Saudi's refineries, gas fields, and export ports are on the eastern side of the country. Even the western refineries are linked to the east via pipelines. If the Strait of Hormuz closes, Saudi oil is essentially stuck. There's no plan B. This is one reason Saudi Arabia continues cutting oil production. With so much risk in the region, it doesn't make sense to ramp up exports. Prices are high, but the political risk is higher. Now let's look at the United States-Venezuela oil deal that's been making headlines. Is it a game changer? Kind of, but not in the way most think. It won't solve the short-term energy crunch, but what it will do is shift the global oil landscape. By lifting sanctions, the United States is positioning itself to grab more of Venezuela's oil, and in the process, squeeze out countries like China. Here's how China has been buying about 300,000 barrels a day from Venezuela. That's roughly 40% of Venezuela's total production. And because of sanctions, China got that oil at deep discounts. We're talking $20 per barrel cheaper than Brent, and even better than the deals they got from Iran. Now that U.S. companies can compete for that oil, China faces higher prices. They'll have to bid against India and U.S. refiners, especially now that American firms can buy directly from PDVSA, Venezuela's state oil company. It's a strategic move. The U.S. knows their past sanctions were backfiring, reducing global oil supply and helping China grow on the cheap. So the U.S. is lifting sanctions, not to save the oil market, but to redirect Venezuelan oil away from China and toward the West. According to S&P Global, U.S. oil firms can now invest in Venezuela again, at least for the next 6 months. But don't expect a big production surge. Venezuela's oil sector is in terrible shape. Output has collapsed from 3 million barrels a day to just 700,000. That's the direct result of sanctions. Even if the sanctions are fully lifted, rebuilding the industry will take time and, well, serious investment. The crude itself is thick and hard to refine. Only U.S. and Chinese refineries are really equipped to handle it. So while the U.S. might try to plant its flag on Venezuelan oil fields, it won't fix the global supply situation overnight. Realistically, if Venezuela can get back to 1 million barrels per day by 2025, that would be a win. But the real goal here is simple. Keep that extra oil away from China and force them to depend more on the Middle East, which, as we've seen, is anything but stable right now. This economic war is intensifying. Everything is being weaponized, not just currencies and frozen assets, but commodities like oil too. The US and Europe are being stretched thin, financing the war in Ukraine, supporting Israel, and trying to contain China's rise. Washington knows it's losing ground in the Middle East. If that slips away completely, they also lose influence over global oil markets. That's why they're making fast moves, like lifting sanctions on Venezuela. It all comes back to energy dominance. Even if the world goes green, the power will still revolve around who controls the flow of energy. And let's not forget, winter is coming. Russia still supplies 10% of Europe's LNG, and if things escalate, Putin could pull the plug again. Middle Eastern supplies could also be cut if the conflict spreads. Yes, the US could try to cover some of that with more gas exports, but prices would skyrocket globally. So we need to be ready. Things are getting wild and they're going global. What do you think? Will the EU really use the frozen Russian reserves? How will Russia respond? Let me know in the comments. Stay safe, hit that like button, and subscribe so we can keep tracking these chaotic shifts together.